Welcome to Next Round with me, Dale McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. Two major things we want to talk about today. The first being a new report by the Central Statistics Office has been released, and it looks at the projection for Ireland's population growth over the next number of decades. And Ireland's population under this report is projected to possibly rise to as high as 7 million people by 2057. So we want to look at this report, analyse its implications for policy around ageing population, demographics, education, and a number of other considerations, including immigration. And also, there's been a new report that's been commissioned and nearly released by BCG, Boston Consulting Group, in the US, which looks at the impact of marriage equality on the economy over the last 20 years in the US. And I think that's somewhere where we want to start with. But before we do that, of course, would like to encourage all of our listeners and viewers to like, follow and subscribe to our various channels. Your support means a lot to us as we keep on building this community. But David, I think let's turn first of all to this report on marriage equality in the US. And 2024, this year, marks 20 years since the state of Massachusetts in the US first legalized marriage equality for same-sex couples. And of course, it's 9 years since the US Supreme Court gave its landmark decision, which granted marriage equality across all 50 states in the US. And with that, BCG has been looking at data over the last 20 years to see what has been the economic impact on marriage equality over that period of time. And with that, there's been a bit of a difference, first of all, on the data with respect to financial and non-financial circumstances for both married and unmarried same-sex couples. The report notes that while the impact of marriage for different sex couples has been well documented, it has not really been explored to the same context with respect to same-sex couples. So this report looks at that. So BCG has conducted a new and pretty extensive bit of research. And what it's saying is that, just some headline figures, which I'd like to read out, is that same-sex couples have contributed up to $125 billion to the US economy through additional growth in net worth and also consumer spending since 2004. So since this report in March 2024 of this year, of course, BCG surveyed around 4,000 individuals, both single and in relationships across the US, to understand their financial circumstances and sentiments. And with that, some of the key findings which the report outlines is that, first of all, on average, married same-sex couples reported a median household net worth that is approximately $130,000 higher than that of their unmarried same-sex counterparts. So their net worth is obviously significantly higher. Married same-sex couples report spending nearly $4,000 more each year than those who aren't married. So they have more and they spend more. And 77% of individuals in married couples also reported more sentiments around feeling more secure, more committed, and more settled compared to those who aren't married or before they were married. And also, when you compare them to unmarried couples, individuals in married same-sex relationships report a higher life satisfaction, up 17%, and a lower incidence of symptoms related to anxiety and depression, down 8%. So with that, you're seeing, I think, a pretty interesting correlation between those feelings and marriage itself. BCG also estimates that the report includes that over the past 20 years, those who are in same-sex marriages have collectively accrued more than $100 billion in additional net worth when compared to unmarried same-sex couples, and have also spent an additional $25 billion. So, with that, I think pretty interesting report. Again, this is just the headlines. The full detailed report is meant to be released later on, but I think it speaks to a lot of what we've been discussing over the last number of episodes around this whole concept of marriage, and why is it that so many people want to be to have marriage. It is a milestone which people strive for, but of course the whole element around milestone recession and how it's further and further away from when people want to, and when it's being achieved.
Yeah, so Dale, this is a great report. I wish we'd have the full data. I'm looking forward to when that comes out. You mentioned the milestone recession. I was doing a bit of work this week looking at the different types of milestones that people list as being a milestone. And marriage comes up a lot, but the broader concept of partnership comes up. It's things like milestones, like some people list your first kiss, first romantic partner. Humans are just hardwired to be with each other, be it straight couples or gay couples. And this is a lesser studied area. And it's only something that is becoming more studied in light of marriage equality brought in, as you said, over 20 years ago in Massachusetts, but more recently in Ireland since about 2015. I'd be really curious to know what the numbers in Ireland would show. But because we're a smaller country, the numbers of people who have gone into same-sex marriages in Ireland is still relatively small. It's picking up as the years go by, but we'll probably end up eventually with enough data to be able to make similar findings for Ireland. The point whereby you're seeing higher net income and higher spending, I think that must speak to the fact that the LGBT population, on average, must therefore have must be working typically in higher paid occupations. That may, for example, reflect a higher incidence of LGBT people working in the services sector, where there would be higher incomes. This is US data, but I would imagine that replicates in other Western countries as well.
Yeah, just added on that, in my previous life, when I worked at the Canadian LGBT plus Chamber of Commerce in Canada, when you look at businesses that were owned by members of that segment, a significant part of that actually was services. So definitely correlates to what you're saying there with the US data.
That's it, yeah. And I don't know whether that's down to the fact that the kind of primary and secondary industries like agriculture and manufacturing tend to be maybe a bit more macho male. I don't know to what extent.
Probably.
Is it that yeah. So it might have been that, look, maybe gay people have kind of steered towards self-employment, towards starting businesses, towards services economy, where there just isn't that same environment. But what it also speaks to is a higher education level. I have seen data on that to say that basically, if you're LGBT, there's a higher education that goes along with it. I was really interested where it shows 77% of same-sex couples say they feel more secure, committed, and settled than before they were married. That dovetails with a lot of the research out there on what marriage brings to straight couples. A lot of the research that's out there does look at straight marriage, which has been for generations the more prevalent and well studied marriage. But what you find there amongst that research is, as reflects here, more security, more sense of commitment. You find lower rates of anxiety and depression, as is found in this study, higher overall health, so longer longevity, for example. And this speaks to the benefits that people get basically by spending time with other people, because when you are in a marriage, you inevitably end up spending significant amounts of time with other people. When you're not married, there's a higher risk of people living alone, not having the same touch points with their communities. And I think it was the CDC in the US now describes what they call as an epidemic of loneliness. That's reflecting trends that you see in the US and elsewhere, whereby this idea of bowling alone, that people are no longer involved in community activities anymore. People aren't getting as married as much, so there's more people living alone. But there are some studies which show that living loneliness and living on your own can be as big a risk as smoking or drinking to your health.
That's right. Yeah, no, and I've also picked up on that as well, where it's been flagged as a big problem with respect to health outcomes, wellness, and overall life expectancy. I think the report also makes clear that these advantages with respect to marriage likely contribute to a positive financial position when you compare those who are married to those who are not. And with that, married couples, of course, have greater equity in housing, stocks, savings together, household income, than their unmarried counterparts. So it's that piece around reaping those benefits when being a unit, being together. And then there's a bit of a compounding effect then as time goes on. Now, of course, what it doesn't talk about, and I think the time horizon on this is a bit shorter, is around marriage is one thing, well, divorce is another, right? And I think given that marriage equality, again, it's only 9 years in the US and Ireland, and there's a bunch of countries only more recently. We probably haven't seen the time horizon yet for, will there be marriage breakdowns? What does that look like in comparison to the straight population, which I think might be interesting as well, if there's a lower deviation or higher deviation.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything to that effect either. That will only emerge over time. Yeah, because I think I have seen data to say that a decent number of marriages can take around like 8 or 9 years before divorce comes along. People do instinctively give it time. And I know in Ireland you have to spend 2 years apart before you can get any divorce. Yeah. It used to be 4 years. So there's a bit of that coming in as well. Dale, I'm interested. So you've lived in Dublin, you've lived in Toronto, I know you live in London, and you've been plugged into the different communities over there over the years. Do you think marriage is as valued? So it's a right now in these countries for gay and straight couples. Yeah. Is it as valued within the communities there as it is amongst the straight population?
Yeah, it's a hard one to answer, David, because I think, again, this is really just my lived experience, and I think the traditional sentiment within Ireland and the UK is where I think marriage is on that pedestal. I think it is defined as being something that is, especially in Ireland, I think, like an institution that's valued, that's important, that's
it's part of your trajectory in life.
Yeah, I think it's part of your trajectory in life. Well, I think definitely my experience would be in the North American sentiment, especially in Canada. It wasn't as revered, I would say. I definitely, and again, this is just from my qualitative engagements with people over the years, would be that the likes of marriage, even then taking a step back, let's say the likes of monogamy or open relationships, I think that was a lot more prevalent. I think on the round in a North American context. I would say this side of the world, that traditionalist mindset is probably more ingrained across the board in society. But again, no data or facts really to back that up, other than what I have felt.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. Like, it's going to be very hard actually to ever estimate something like that, because the population that identifies as gay or lesbian is more commonly gotten through surveys as opposed to being asked in the census. Actually, though, in Ireland there is a move to try and put in a question on that for the next census in 2027 that it would ask for sexual orientation.
It's captured in the Canadian census. It's captured.
Oh, is it? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we may actually then eventually get there across a few countries.
Yeah.
You would then know the total population. You would then be able to mark out what the marriage rate is within the gay population, and then you'd have the wider straight number, and then you'd actually be able to see, okay, the rate of marriage is higher or lower. I'm not too sure what it might it might emerge as.
Yeah.
It might take a bit of time. Like there might be initially a lower number, and then look, fast forward through the decades, it might emerge higher. But the one thing I think is really a problem. I'm just thinking back to the debate we had earlier this year on durable relationships and the referendum, and the idea of loosening the definition of marriage as only being, the definition of family as only being based on marriage. I think it was a missed opportunity to carve out a newer message on that. Yes, that wording that's there, if it didn't say it explicitly, but it kind of spoke more towards straight marriages essentially as being the bedrock of the family. But I think there's a newer case to make in today's age to say, actually, no, families are diverse, they are different, but marriage, because we have expanded it to include same-sex couples, is actually something we should double down on, and we should reaffirm as being foundational values for society. That newer, inclusive, wider net that now captures gay couples in it is something that should continue to be promoted. But that kind of messaging just never emerged there. It was all about, okay, durable relationships, you can have whatever you like in terms of your setup. And I don't think that's good enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah. And of course, there was the debate around what was a durable relationship. We couldn't even define it the day before the referendum, but we don't need to go over old ground. But I think the piece around marriage, and again, when marriage equality came on the agenda, and the question around basically extending the franchise of marriage and the institution of marriage to those beyond the typical, straight definition. I recall David Cameron in the UK when he was Prime Minister. He was, his passionate defense of this was around, I don't believe in marriage equality in spite of being a conservative. I believe in marriage equality because I am a conservative, and the whole point of that was around, with marriage being the grounding force and institution and bedrock for society, and from that everything is built on, is important and needs to be opened and inclusive. And of course, also marriage equality. If you look at its introduction across Europe, actually it's been mostly conservative European governments that have introduced marriage equality in various forms as well. So, like, my point there is, I think you're on something with respect to, there was an opportunity there. But again, I suppose, David, on the counter to that, though, is, it was an opportunity for government to make the case for marriage. But if we look at young people, do we think that young people kind of really want it, really aspire to it? I know some of the data says that it's a milestone that they would like to achieve, but do they really, or has that just changed?
Well, it's gone much later. So if you look at the census in Ireland and you look at the early 30s cohort, 30 to 35, which is our bracket, we are now a majority single, a majority never married cohort. And it's the first time we've been a majority never married for about 100 years. There was a census back in, I think, the 1930s, which did show a slim majority not married. Then we went as low as 20%. So there was a time when 80% of people in their early 30s were married. That would have been kind of mid last century. And now we've notched right higher again. It looks like there's a bit of a cycle here. We go through cycles of marriage being valued and promoted and happening at a younger age, and then it drifts. And it looks like we're in a drift at the moment. So to answer your question, yes, there probably isn't politically the basis to actually go out with that kind of messaging now. We would probably get rejected. But look, I try and speak for me with this, and I know that you're more on that wavelength than the kind of the indifference category. I don't think there's a hostile anti-marriage bucket out there. I think most people just go towards periods of indifference. I'm kind of more of the view, you need to kind of promote this. You need to actually beef this up in your messaging in overall society. Otherwise, it just drifts, and then you end up with the later marriages. You end up then with people starting families later, and that causes all the kind of wider problems that we have now around fertility and lower population growth.
Yeah, which I know we'll get into in a bit with respect to this. Yeah. So, but then the other challenge, of course, in marriage is, of course, the unique challenges that are being faced. Now, I suppose some are unique, but if you look at housing, for example, I mean, if you go back in time to the 1930s or 40s, I mean, housing wasn't exactly great for the population. I'm sure there was, 5, 6, 7 to a home at any given point.
Hmm.
But then also, I mean, look, you have the issue around disruption and dating and technology, and we're a lot more mobile as a population now, and people, emigrating and coming back, and there's a transiency as well, which I think needs to be factored in. So I think it's just difficult, right? And it's I think, the aspiration for marriage, it's met with lots of challenges right now, I think, which is,
Oh, it is. Yeah. I mean, when you have housing as expensive as it is, when that is a later in life milestone, I think that has contributed to marriages and families happening later too. I think longer education is part of it. What you said about being more mobile as well, that also comes into it. Some people like to spend a bit of time in other cities in their 20s when they're mobile, and then getting married kind of gets pushed back. Marriage has that association with kind of bedding yourself down within a community, and actually kind of spending quote unquote the rest of your life. I mean, look, it is in sickness and health until death do you part. So therefore, people are going to associate it with being a little less mobile, and there is this constant. People use language like "you're less free." You're kind of the language of being kind of nailed down by
yeah,
it. I think that language isn't helpful because
no.
you eventually need to embrace
Well, there's a
that
negative connotation to
that
it, right? Yeah.
there is, and that's why promoting the idea of it being a responsibility, that you've a responsibility to the other person. Having attended three weddings, excuse me, in the past couple of months, you come across the themes of each side of the couple looking after each
Yeah.
other. And that being as much a responsibility as it is a right to get married and to have the happy day and to live happily ever after, etc.
You're going
There's
you're going through the divorce, sorry, the marriage cycle right now. Just fast forward 20 years and be a bit sadder with the divorce the divorce circle you might be going through.
other advice. Yeah. Well, please God, it won't be me included. But let's see. It'll be someone. It'll be
Yeah.
someone we know. But that's the tragedy
There's
of it.
another mindset actually, just while I'm thinking of it, that it came into my head, which is around, the millennial mindset. And I look at this from my own work, working in, with leadership and talent, which is this piece around, people having an adverse reaction to, a job for life, being in a job for 10, 20 years, being in the same place. People, more so now, that's not for them. I wonder what the correlation with that view then is on marriage, where they see it as this is it for life. And does that forever mindset be met with that allergic reaction?
That's a very good point. Yeah, because the idea of no longer having a job for life, as you said, it's very prevalent now. There's data that shows, for example, that people who move jobs more frequently tend to get higher pay boosts than if you stick around in the same firm. So you have that challenge on the one side of building up a culture in your own life of being a mover and of wanting to kind of change things a bit more frequently. And then you're being presented with the idea of, okay, well, I should have a really stable relationship. I should try and, commit not just to one person, but to one city, and to be kind of bedded down there. That becomes probably a tension in some people's lives. So that's a very good point. You can understand
Yeah,
that.
well, I think it's you have the argument of the grass is greener, right? And I think given in the technological world that we live in, and how accessible, people are, and we always compare ourselves to other people, blah blah blah. I just wonder, is that question on people's mind? Does it make them kind of reject the institution, not want to go there, see it as a thing of the past? But of course, all of the data shows us that, when two people are in a marriage together, and it's enduring and it lasts, the economic benefits are significant. There's a compounding effect.
Yeah.
And then you also have, to your point earlier on, those health benefits and well-being benefits, which of course come with that.
Well, that's it. So I think, whilst I outlined why that's maybe a tension in people's minds, the better solution that I see is, look, be married, get married, and then you're actually in a better position to go and move jobs and change jobs. You've got a support there. You've got a household which may be a better fortress against the risks that come around that. Look, you might do one job change, it doesn't work out. Well, look, you have a relationship there that is still thriving and that can support you through that. That's the better attitude, I think.
Yeah. It's a fascinating topic. It's a really interesting report from the sounds of it. Again, this is just the headlines which came out from BCG quite recently. When the full report does come out, we will keep an eye on it, and I'm sure we'll definitely bring it back up for discussion here. But I think if we're just going to pivot now for a moment, there's some themes which we were talking about a moment ago, which I think are pretty relevant with respect to this CSO report. So quick headline here, CSO population labor force projections were released, and they looked at 3 different population growth scenarios over the time period from 2023 up as far as 2057. The data is based on the census that took place in Ireland in 2022. And in a high population increase scenario, the population is expected to rise by over 2 million people to there about 7 million. In its lowest situation and scenario, it looks like the population will actually peak in the 2040s and slowly decline then up towards 2057. But in all 3 scenarios, deaths are expected to exceed births by the late 2040s. So, it's a big question here around the decline in birth rates, and the impacts on that with respect to, for example, if you look at education right now, declining birth rates means less demand for the number of kids in primary school. But at the same time, aging population and the costs associated with that with respect to pensions, support, healthcare, etc. So it's a pretty interesting report, David, and I think lots to unpack.
Yeah, I might just pick up on that primary schools piece that you mentioned. So the Department of Education put out an analysis only in April this year, I believe, where they looked at projected primary school enrollments. Now, they were just taking the last census forecast and putting a chart on it or putting a table on it, but it showed enrollments in primary school falling towards kind of the middle of next decade, 2037. They'd be around 480,000 with a notch higher to 500,000. So sorry, to say, from the context, we're currently at around 540,000 of enrollments each year. So just say what that is then, that's people of age between 5 and 12, your typical primary school years, and each year, whatever number of people you have in the country, you presume that they are a primary school enrollment, just because, well, if everyone of that age does go to primary school, almost everyone of that age, okay? But the new projections that we have out here, all 3 of those scenarios that you mentioned, all take us to a lower number. There's a lower bottom number in 2037, but it actually declines even further towards the year 2042.
Yeah.
So where we're currently, as I said, around 540,000, we could have as few as 400,000. So just top of my head, I think that's about 140,000 fewer primary school kids. I mean, you're talking about these magnitudes here in the order of around 20 or even 25%. This is a massive decline in the primary school population. There's 2 fallouts from this. Either you have the money in the budget and you can change the pupil-teacher ratio. So same number of teachers, just teaching smaller classrooms. A lot of teachers out there will be very happy if that happens.
A lot of parents too. A lot of parents.
Yeah. And the governments of the day will be able to say, look, hey, we've delivered this. The flip side of this, though, is if the money isn't there to keep schools going. Like, I've done a bit of work recently about the expense of running a school. So schools are funded based on a capitation grant. That's per pupil. So if you have fewer pupils, you don't get the same money to run the school.
That's right.
If it's harder to run the school, schools are going to look around and say, look, maybe we just need to merge, or maybe we need to shut down and just add a few more classrooms to a nearby school. This is a potential scenario. All 3 of these scenarios show that in 2 decades' time, we could be looking at days of school closures.
And Dave, just the driver of this. So in all scenarios, we're seeing a decrease in school kids.
Yes. But an increase in adult population.
Well, this is the point, right? So, and of course, that is inferred because the natural population of Ireland is just decreasing.
Yeah. So the mix effect here is that the fertility rate, which is currently around 1.55 children per family, that's expected to notch lower to 1.3 by 2037. And they assume these are assumptions into a model, but they assume you hit that 1.3 and then it stabilizes. But the net migration number continues to be elevated. So you're assuming on average 10,000 extra persons a year, up to as high as 45,000 persons per year. But regardless of which of those two scenarios you get, you're still assuming this low fertility, which means you have a growing adult population because migrants tend to be of working age when they arrive, but you don't have a new generation coming along with births, because births are lower, as I was saying. So that's how you end up with this mix effect. The economy will be happy in the broadest terms. There'll be good tax take, 7 million people, you have a lot of people working. That means that you don't face the same aging population problems from a cost point of view as you might otherwise have had. But a situation where you don't have enough kids is a longer term problem under the surface. An analogy I once heard about low fertility is that it's like when a star goes out in the galaxy. The brightness of that star might still be visible from Earth for many years after the star has gone out, but because you're traveling light years, you don't actually realize that the star has actually died before it's visible. This over the decades is a slow moving car crash, I think, because of the low fertility.
I think that was either the same quote, or I think a similar quote was actually Elon Musk, I think, where he said a civilization that ends not with a bang but a whimper in adult diapers is probably more crude version of the analogy, but same point.
Yes.
Yeah. I think this is really interesting because just to reference Canada as again an area that's known to me, but I think facing a really similar problem as well. So Canada's population last year, so 2023, touched a record high of 40.7 million people. And in that year alone, the country added 1.27 million people. Okay, so population up 3.2% from last year, from the previous year, marking its highest population growth since 1957. The vast majority, or over 97% of that, came from international migration, both permanent and temporary immigration. The remaining portion, just 2.4%, actually came from a natural increase, which I think shows a really big problem as well in Canada with respect to its population situation.
I think these trends are a gift to the far right.
I agree.
This is exactly the kind of numbers. If this bigger, the 45,000, the higher end of the Irish number, were to come along, you're asking for 2-3 general elections from now. For the main centre parties, and let's call it the wide centre, include the Greens, include Labour, include Soc Dems, for all of them to be down, and for the more populist left and right groups, however they may emerge, to be the more dominant forces in Irish society. Look at what's happening in the UK now. Yeah. Their migration debate is more established than ours. They had these problems with the EU. You go back a decade, where they had massive influx of Eastern Europeans. The mood came along to say, look, we don't want this. You now have 5 populists from the Reform Party in Parliament. You had the Jeremy Corbyn wave. You got more volatile politics coming out of those debates.
Just add some colour to that piece as well. Just on the UK element, of course, the whole question of immigration. In 2016, their net inward migration was 350,000 people. Brexit happened, they left. Then if you fast forward to more recent years, net inward is over 800,000. And of course, at Brexit time, the split was roughly 50-50 between EU and non-EU. Now it's vast majority, upwards of 90%, are now non-EU coming into the UK. And an interesting stat, David, I heard recently and saw recently with respect to the recent UK election is, you referenced Reform, 5 members of Parliament now since the election, but in over 102 constituencies, Reform came second.
Yeah, and in the UK, you come second, you don't take a seat. If you come second place, in a swathe of Irish constituencies, you will pick up seats because of proportional representation here.
Yeah.
Now, look, there's no great political grouping around, the far right or any of the anti-migrant stuff at the moment. They're all very dispersed parties with very little impact. But all it's going to take is either for some of the people in the main parties to actually kind of change their messaging, or for significant popular parties to emerge in Ireland on this issue. Important to explain why I think this is the case. I'm not saying that I believe that there are net positives to migration. A lot of the research out there shows it's good for the economy, good for tax take. The people who come tend not to be people with malice intent towards how they're going to live their lives. They're mostly people who want to just get on with their lives, work hard, go out, make some money, maybe send a bit back home, just like Irish people did when we went abroad. But I don't get to decide how people feel when that M1 high population scenario comes in. I'm just looking at what I think is likely. It's very likely that I think there's going to be pushback to that. I think it's very likely that you're going to see, take the topic of clustering, for example. Yes, we'll still have a country where the vast majority of people in the round are people who have been born here and raised here, and all of that. But you're going to have pockets in the country where recently arrived people will cluster. How can we be sure that you don't end up with some social problems that emerge from that? I think for the most part, integration in Ireland has been done well so far. But just to give context on some of these numbers, we have, as of today, about 1 million of our 5 million, people who weren't born here initially. But we're talking about adding another 2 million onto that. So we could be a country of 7 million, 4 of whom were born here, but 3 of whom either first, second generation who weren't. And I think the numbers, when they get that high, are going to cause unforeseen problems.
Well, the other part of the equation, David, I think is, you have that element around the number of people who are coming into the country. And again, I say this from my perspective as someone who has done it now twice in 2 different countries. But I think the real problem is also population growth, as we've mentioned here before. It is decreasing. People are having less kids. They're having it later in life. There are challenges facing them. And until we find ways from a policy perspective to really spur that growth in population and to get people in an economic situation and having that social stability to be able to grow that population and grow families and increase their birth rate, that's the other side of the equation that I think is not really on people's agenda right now. And the longer we delay this, the more the more probability, to your point, I think, David, on the M1 situation, really boiling over in terms of our political situation.
Yeah, like I need to be clear that the idea of a population of 7 million people is a great idea.
Yeah.
The idea of having a bigger population gives you economy of scale. It means delivery of public services better. It means there's more ambulances, so you have less of a waiting time. It means you have more Garda stations.
I think there's a psyche element to it as well, because Ireland's population was 6.5 million pre-famine. We still, over 150 years on, still have this psyche issue, I think, with respect to our identity, where we're still not what we were, which I think it affects how we see ourselves.
That probably does. So I think there's an instinctive recognition, I think, in Ireland that, look, because we used to be bigger, we can be bigger again. I think people in the round aren't against overall population growth, but I think there's a challenge. I think it's not going to work if it's almost all through net migration, because, I mean, as you're saying, we're going to get to the later years where deaths will outnumber births. That's just not going to be tenable to have a country that is growing exclusively in those years from net inward migration. It's just not going to fly.
Yeah, and I've referenced Japan as an example of this, where they have totally gone on the other end of the spectrum, which is to not really have any sort of net inward migration at all. And their population was 127 million in 2016. Last year it was 124. They lost 3 million people without a conflict in 7 years, which is unbelievable. But again, they're a country that I think have totally gone on the other side of the spectrum and, not wanting to have, an immigrant inward population growth policy.
Yeah, I think that's important to highlight, just the side of this debate that we don't want to end up on,
Correct.
where there's hostility to any sort of net inward
Yeah.
migration. I think that the challenge here is that we're just going to be so heavy, almost exclusively on the net immigration side, that it's going to be problematic, and the number is going to be very high.
Yeah.
I would prefer a lower overall growth number with a mix of higher fertility and net inward migration. You have to have net inward
You
migration.
do.
There's good reasons why. I mean, like all the multinationals are here, they rely on net inward migration to be able to run their companies.
But also,
like
how we fund the country. If we don't have a growing population, whatever way it looks like, that's a debt spiral for a country.
Yeah,
we won't be able to afford how we run our public finances, how we educate, how we pay our elderly, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that other side of the spectrum, I think, really needs to be called out, because it's not, and that's way worse.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we have run out of time. So I think really interesting conversation this week. If you did like this podcast, please share and follow us on all social on all platforms, all social media platforms, on all podcast platforms. We're also available on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel. Please, again, subscribe, and follow. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you watching and listening to us, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks again.